Welcome to the Book Gallery, a series of conversations with writers and scholars of imagination and erudition. All right, so I'm your host, Luke Sheahan, editor of the University Bookman. Founded by Russell Kirk, the University Bookman redeems the time by identifying and discussing books that diagnose the modern age and support a renewal of culture and the common good. Today, we will discuss one of Dr. Kirk's favorite topics, Gothic horror. Now, many of you probably know that Russell Kirk threw his writings on conservatism and the Constitution, but did you know that he is hailed as one of the great ghost story writers of the 20th century? Stephen King, Ray Bradbury, T.S. Eliot all admired his work in this regard and thought him a master of the genre. You probably know that Dr. Kirk's 1953 masterpiece, The Conservative Mind, is hailed as one of the founding books of the conservative movement. But did you know that his 1961 novel, Old House of Fear, outsold all of his other books combined, and that his ghost story, A Long, Long Trail a Winding, won a World Fantasy Award in 1977? Kirk was not interested in didacticism, but in infusing his stories with religious, moral, and political convictions. In his stories, good and evil are real but mysterious powers that work in our world. So here we are, just in time for Halloween, to discuss this forgotten aspect of Kirk's work. I am joined by Adam Simon, a Hollywood screenwriter and with a number of horror movies and series to his name, and James Panero, executive editor of the new Criterion, and the man responsible for a new edition of Old House of Fear. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hey, nice to be here.
I want to start off by talking about Old House of Fear. It is his most famous work. As I said, outsold all of his other books combined. James, you brought out a new edition of this book, and you wrote a wonderful introduction to it. Can you start us off? What was Kirk doing with this story?
Sure, and I have to say what a pleasure it is to be here. If Russell Kirk were writing today, instead of urban planners, the villains might be Silicon Valley, right?
That's right.
But so it was in 2018 that your predecessor, Gerald Rossello, came to us with the idea for an essay on Russell Kirk, timed to the centenary of his birth. And we thought, well, why don't we make a conference out of this, build this around Gerald's essay? And so we held a conference, and I proposed looking at Dr. Kirk from a different point of view than most everyone else in the conference, which was to look at his fiction. I feel like people either know his fiction or they know his political writing, but often they're not really discussed in the same conversation. And I felt like something was really missing there because in my opinion, they're intimately tied together. So we held the conference, and hard to believe, totally unplanned, but it actually occurred on the very day of his birth, 100 years later, this conference. And that was very meaningful to us. And I hoped we had brought up a reverent spirit in doing our duty to Dr. Kirk that day. We published the essays, I believe, in January 2019. So I think you can go back at newcriterion.com and see them all there. After that came out, Roger Kimball and I talked about, well, why don't we bring out a new edition of Russell Kirk's fiction writing? Old House of Fear was not in circulation anymore. It was not in print. There have been some reprints, but they were very hard to get. And so we said, let's put out a new copy through our own imprint, Criterion Books, which is the imprint of the new Criterion. I supplied the introduction. And so that's how that came to be. And I would just say that I couldn't believe how good this writing was, this fiction was. I mean, I can believe it because he's a great writer, but often you don't think of one person can do both things as equally well. But wow, these were good. His ghost stories were amazing. They are amazing. They stay with us today. Incredibly well executed stories. And then the Old House of Fear was a real page turner, and you can see why it was such a bestseller. I wrote about this in the introduction, but it involved a kind of a red-haired ingenue, and it was not really such a big part of the story, but the people who sold the book made it a big deal and put this very spicy lady on the cover, and people would buy it at the checkout counter, and that's how it ended up outselling, as you say, all his other books. And I think put the Kirk family in better financial condition for kind of the, everything he was doing up there in Mecosta.
What are you kind of give us a sense for the themes that are going on in this book? I've read it multiple times, and every time my skin crawls at certain points.
Yeah, it's it's not quite a ghost story in the same way of his ghost stories, where there's really spirits and ghosts coming and haunting people. But as I write, it feels like haunted land. It allowed him to revisit Scotland, where he had received his degree, St. Andrews, and especially these haunted Outer Hebrides islands that he knew very well and was able to describe intimately. It's interesting. I feel like I read that he often wrote late at night. One of his essays, he signs off, it's 3 a.m, the witching hour. And I feel like all the stories, the lights are out. I don't think there's much daylight penetrating any of these fictional works. And it feels like that when you read Old House of Fear. It's briefly, there's an American industrialist, like an Andrew Carnegie character who, like Andrew Carnegie, wants to return to his ancestral homeland and reclaim this old house of fear and buy it. He sends an agent to do it, and there's a great deal of difficulty getting to the island. And it turns out a very wicked character is in control of this house. There's a lot of, as I say, kind of John Buchan-like intrigue involving the Cold War, which is a surprise, but also the third eye and a whole bunch of other kind of wicked spiritual beliefs and actions. And I won't say how it ends, but there are many twists and turns, and just the quality of the writing, the way he describes the landscape here and throughout all the ghost stories is just so it's haunting. Truly, it's haunting.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd add into that, and besides my sheer gratitude, James, that you brought it back out for people to discover again, the surprise to me reading it, because I knew the short stories, and I have to say I'm someone, and we'll come back to this, I'm sure, that, like you said, Luke, who came to Kirk entirely from the horror stories. We'll also come back to that, because I'm keen on us really admitting that they're horror stories, not just ghost stories, that they're really horrific. And what does that horror have to do with his conservatism, his traditionalism, and all those things? But this book, it's action-packed. I mean, it's not, we often think of the Gothic as a female in peril story. And there is, as you mentioned, James, the really adorable and quirky, great gal who is at stake in this, but she's only present in about 1/5 of the book. That, other than, like you said, in your comparison to Buchan, is great. And for those who don't know Buchan, this is a guy who wrote the 39 Steps. So there's almost a Hitchcockian thing. And it felt in that sense like a Hitchcockian thriller. It's dark alleyways and scrambling over the rocks and IRA, sort of redeemed IRA terrorists battling it out with what may be closeted communist agents, who are terrified that they themselves may be being caught by their own Stalinist henchmen. I mean, I don't know of any other such classic, traditional, not supernatural, as you point out, James, but classically Gothic and haunting settings with, this kind of Cold War thriller elements where, like you mentioned, and this was one of my favorite things in it, that there's something that could be out of Charles Williams or some of the more spiritualist, or Eliot types, and that they're kind of, having fistfights and gunfights with communist agents on the rocky shores of this incredible island. It's also very funny, by the way. He must have been I don't know if any of you, dealt with the man himself, but he's very funny too, because it's very hard to pull off in contexts like this. Not tongue-in-cheek stuff, but that the characters themselves are filled with life and humor and stuff. So if you haven't read it, you'll love it, and you won't be able to stop when you start. I wasn't.
Oh yeah, I've lost my share of sleep, staying up, reading Kirk's and rereading Kirk's stories. Now he has a number of short stories, which did well as well. One of his themes throughout his work throughout his ghost stories is righteous judgment. It could be retributive or punitive. but it's a recurrent theme. One of his short stories, Ex Tenebris, Out of the Darkness. We see a political aspect of Kirk's work. So Kirk hated centralization schemes. He was an early critic of certain urban renewal projects. And he gets on this pretty early. I think his story comes out in 1950s, I believe. So he's critical of this stuff long before. And we get in this short story an archetype of one of Kirk's villains, the meddling bureaucrat. So in this story, we've got an old woman, an old widow, Mrs. Oliver, who's returned. She's lived abroad her whole life, her whole adult life, with her husband, who was an army officer, and he dies, and she returns to her girlhood home to live out the last of her days. However, there's a meddling bureaucrat, SGW Barner, who wants her moved into a planned living facility so he can flatten her old home along with the rest of the neighborhood and make something new. He doesn't really actually care what, just something else that's centrally planned to replace it. And so he's going to figure out some way to get Mrs. Oliver out. And so there's Mrs. Oliver is obviously bothered by this, and she spends her days in the broken down cemetery around the old church she went to as a little girl, and she cleans off the headstones. And kind of sits among the the fallen from her girlhood. They're all gone now. Then she receives a visitor, I should say Reverend Abner Hargreaves, who, unknown to her, passed away some years earlier. And this man has this kind of really raspy voice, and he's always sweating. His hair's dripping with sweat, and it's this kind of creepy sense. She doesn't understand why, because it's not raining out. And he's always drinking her tea kind of voraciously. And then he has this great moment where he puts in a call. I won't say a phone call, a call to Mr. Barner. And Mr. Barner is told to meet him at night, of course, in the unlit cemetery outside the church, which is broken down. So there's no electricity to it. There's no lighting. This goes with James's theme of darkness. And he meets there with him. And I wanted to read out loud the part of the exchange. It'll give you a sense. We've been talking about how good Kirk is in his writing and how creepy it is. But to give you just a sense of this, and we will, you actually, this Ex Tenebris is read aloud online. You'll be able to get a recording of it. But I'll give you a sense. So this vicar shows up. He asks kind of repeatedly for Barner, for charity. I'm asking you for charity. Leave Mrs. Oliver alone for her girlhood memories. And Barner is insistent. No, she must go. She has to be moved into a communal living center. Everything will be better for her. And then this happens. The vicar says, but I do ask you this last time for charity. Or did he say it? His lips had not moved. And abruptly it came to Barner that the vicar's lips had not stirred before. That rigid face was a mask. And the words Barner had thought he heard had sounded only in his own brain, not in his ears, even on the telephone. Barner clutched a stone bench within the porch. What tricks the darkened mist played? Of course the vicar's lips must have moved. No one could play ventriloquist in this place. No, insisted Barner, scowling. His assurance partially recovered. I never grant exceptions to any scheduled scheme. How loathsome that parson's features were. I say, vicar, if we must talk of this longer, shan't we shift out of this wind and wet into the church? For Barner wanted mightily to put some interval between himself and that waxy face. My favorite part right here. Safe in the church, you and I, never, cried the parson, in a voice at once exalted and agonized. He smiled frightfully. For now is the axe put to the root of the trees, so that every tree that bringeth forth not good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Then he took Barner by the throat. And Barner's body is discovered later under a collapsed part of the roof in the church. So the meddling bureaucrat gets what's coming to him. And this is actually this figure, the meddling bureaucrat, the urbanist, shows up several times in Kirk's work.
Yeah, I mean, there's a one of my favorite stories is Behind the Stumps, which we should definitely talk about. But it picks up on that, Luke, and it begins with an epigraph from the Bible, from Chronicles or one of them. Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel. And because the villain, such he is in that one, being merely a census taker. But even the census is an affront to Kirk, as it is to God in some sense. And we could go off as a Jew, I could go off on this very odd thing in the Bible about why, and the rabbis talked much about why this was potentially one of the worst things that David did when he ordered Israel to be counted and for all the tribes to come forward. But so yeah, the planners, the bureaucrats, the census takers, all the representatives of modern civilization there. But something else I wanted to jump on there that is in that wonderful passage, Luke, and it's the fact that, and it's part of why I said before about them being horror stories, that we often have this idea of the ghost story as a kind of gentle thing, more akin to the classic English mystery or something. And obviously a lot of them are. And in our memory, they are that more than they are in reality. Because at the end of that, as you say, it throttles him, it grabs him. It's something really physical. This is not just this is not just a spirit that's returned for justice. It's something physical. And it's not that this is without precedent. I mean, M.R. James's stories, H.R. Wakefield's stories, the classic English ghost stories are much more literally visceral than we might think them. You know, even the classic Christmas ones, you know, even Christmas Carol, the actual descriptions of these things. And that's important because it in Kirk's essay on the ghost story, he says something about the idea that the ghost stories, besides having this wonderful phrase that essentially they're experiments in moral imagination, which is, I think, and James, I think you could probably comment on this more learnedly than I, but that is some hint to the link they have to his other thought, that these stories were all to him experiments in moral imagination. But he's at pains to say in the essay that the reason he likes these kinds of stories is because on the one hand, they traffic in symbols and in a world of symbols, but that the symbols are not just symbols. They're physical, they're real, they have teeth, as it were. And if I could point to one more thing, it would be, and I was so struck this time finding it because it's something I had come upon myself doing research for one of my haunted house movies. I think it was Haunting in Connecticut. In terms of ideas of where do these ideas of the haunted house go for it. It's a sign both of this visceral side of the work and of just incredibly, how incredibly erudite and researched Kirk was. It's in Sorworth Place, which is a really important story in there. It's one of these ones where, and you mentioned, I think this before, maybe before we got on, Luke, the idea that he has certain characters. I don't know any other writer like this who did this, with there's characters who appear and reappear, sometimes dead, sometimes alive, in different short stories, often in radically different times. And often you see the story where somebody did something that made them who they are, and then you may later see the supernatural consequence of that. So Sorworth Place is the story where we meet Bain, Ralph Bain, who's a MC, military cross, who's a fallen on bad times war veteran, World War II veteran, who we will meet again, whose ghost we will meet again later in Savior Gate, which is his gentlest and sweetest story for sure. And Sorworth Place will culminate in a truly horrific, visceral, physical battle between Bain and a ghost. But early in the story, they mention that there's this inscription over, again, one of these Gothic piles that the stories take place in. And the Latin quote is larva resurgat. And the narrator wonders, why larva rather than spiritus? Now, not to get too deep into this, but spiritus, spirit, we can all get that. But larva, I had come across that myself in my research for haunting, because the Roman ghost stories, which they basically invented the haunted house story, they always refer to the houses that have larvae in them. And I thought, what is it, like they have insects in them? What is that? But apparently, and clearly Kirk got this, he points to it by saying, why not spiritus? Why larva? And the larva resurges, meaning the larva comes back, it resurges, right? Well, the larva in this Roman thinking is not the ghost. It's something more like you would see like in an old EC comic book, a Tales from the Crypt kind of thing, of like a tattered living corpse. It's a skeleton with bits of flesh. It's very physical that will come back. And it is a figure like that Bain will end up, I don't want to give away the story, but physically wrestling with, again, to save a young woman. And it's just a fantastic example of Kirk's incredible erudition. I mean, where he had found that. I mean, it's literally something scholars that I looked at, 50 years later were just starting to talk about what is this distinction between the larva and the spiritus, and bang, he's got it right there in the intro to the story, but he's also using it, in order to bring this incredibly visceral horror scene, or to plant the seed for this incredibly visceral horror scene that the story culminates in.
So I just want to comment on the conservative mind of Dr. Kirk that we see in Ex Tenebris, published in 1957. I mean, this mind is so different, I think, than the conservative movement was and still is today, for the most part. It's, as you say, anti-central planning. I mean, in 1957, this is before Jane Jacobs, this is before The Power Broker. 1957, he's writing a moral tale about this guy Barner, who sounds like Burner. He's out to burn everything down. And Mrs. Oliver, an olive grove, tending to her crops. And she has to be relocated from her little town of Low Wentford to the new estate council flats estate of Gorst, where there are 6 movie theaters and no churches, as Dr. Kirk explains. I mean, this recurs in probably more than half of the stories, this kind of setup, where there's either a super highway that ran through the town and destroyed it, or the council estate wants to redo things, or in the Surly Sullen Bell, there's a kind of decrepit St. Louis, and he gets stuck in these old. What really haunts us really is our old architecture, as much as anything else, and just the history that we are so willing to bulldoze, and in our obsession with presentism, which is still an obsession, in fact, probably more an obsession today than it even was in 1957. But Kirk saw right through that. And that was what was incredible to me, is these moral tales. It's probably why the ghost story wasn't popular, as he wrote. He thought he was the last one to maintain the ghost story, because this was the era of the future, right? Science fiction. It was all about this great future. Maybe it's a dystopian future, maybe it's a utopian future, but it's still, we're looking ahead. No one wanted to look back at old Italianate buildings and old American vernacular architecture. And this is all he was doing. In fact, he built, in Macassar, his own Italianate building, a home with its own belvedere up the top, in the 1960s. So he was a wonderful anachronism, but he was tapping into forms that so many of the rest of us just wanted to ignore, but he felt them.
That is the essence of it, James. You put your finger right on it, but it's also what really blew me away reading them this time, because nobody listening to that and listening to even you expound on that can do anything but nod and go, but of course, look at what we've lost. Look at what's being bulldozed. Look at the old neighborhoods. Look at the beauty of the old, etc. But what's shocking and striking to me about and says to all of you who are listening, but especially James, I wonder what you might think about this, and how this might link to his kind of strange separation from the conservative movement, or movement conservatism, that comes out of that. There's very little nostalgia in that, though, for him. And when he's defending, he defends the fact that actually it may be quite horrible what that old thing is. It isn't, he's not succumbing to the fantasy of like, oh, we've got to get back to the old plantation or the beautiful old house. I mean, let me share a couple quick passages that get on there, because this is the thing that really got me. Sorworth Place is the other one that's not Sorworth Place, Behind the Stumps, where literally that's the one where the census taker's coming, and everybody in the town keeps saying to him, well, don't try to go to that one area, to count them. You can count everybody else, but don't go there. They don't want to be counted. Let me read you some there. Sort of the friendly shopkeeper who's trying to help out the misbegotten, agent of this modernity that you're talking about, James, and this bureaucrat who's gonna on his way to count it so that you can get the proper taxes and probably come do some improvement. That's Mr. Cribben. He says, now listen, Mr. Cribben, friend, you're a man with spunk and you know your business, but I'm old and I've been hereabouts a while. They're fit in anywhere, Mr. Cribben. Did you ever think about that? I mean, they won't live by your ways and mine. Some of them are too good. Some of them are too bad. Everybody's growing pretty much like everybody in this age. And the ones that don't fit in are scarce, but they're still around. Some are queer, very queer. We can't just count them like so many 15-cent stamps. We can't change them, not soon. But they're shy, most of them. Let them alone. And they're likely to crawl into holes out of the sun. Let them be. They don't signify if you don't stir them up. So it isn't necessarily pleasant things that might be stirred up by this. He's even speaking in a way that doesn't succumb to even the kind of hidden progressivism of the market growth and that of like, no, there's places there where there's bad things. And in this story, in Behind the Stumps, there's a very bad thing indeed, a truly grotesque, an image of the witch more grotesque than anything I could ever have had in Salem. That's what he's being warned about. And yet he's still being told, leave it be. And it gets extreme. Maybe we'll come back to it later in Skyberia, where that is almost like the anti-version, James, of the progressivist science fiction of the day, of where it's going with that an old Mr. Williams, I think it is, who brilliantly delivers the perfect conservative critique of development and renewal and industry and all these things, and of God. But it's a pretty scary image that he's offering up. You know, we can come back to it because I don't want to go on too long. But do you know what I mean? There's something in all of these stories that is not, it's not the fantasy of traditionalism in the same way that as he says at one point, in fact, in the epigram to early on in Surly Sullen Bell, he says he was a reactionary. Ecclesiastes was Bible enough for him. So, okay, you know, that's a very different attitude towards the tradition and towards the Bible than someone, say, who's going to cite the Psalms or the Song of Solomon. You know, he's embracing a pretty dark side of that, and yet still saying that too is what's to be protected and or to be what is to be feared. Or just as last thought on it, I think it's one of his books of essays actually has a title that sounds like one of his horror stories. The wise men know what wicked thing written in. It's a really, and it's maybe, I don't know, again, it's why I remain so fascinated with him, and as a horror writer, why I remain influenced by him, but also why as a citizen, I'm fascinated by his kind of traditionalism, because it isn't rooted in some nostalgic fantasy of the past. There's something else going on there about just the dogged and not always nice nature of things that need to be left alone and can't be improved.
Well, especially I think Behind the Stumps reflects his own background, and we could talk a little bit about his biography here, but his great-grandfather was a lumberman, a timberman who came from the Finger Lakes of New York after what timber remained, and ended up in Michigan, took down all the forests there and ended up, you know, settling Mecosta. And he even mentions that the stump country of Behind the Stumps, some of the grandchildren and great grandchildren of the men who swept off the forests. So he's realistic that it isn't some, as you say, antebellum, Gone with the Wind kind of, it was all great back then. He knows the hard labor and that creates these communities, and there are holes, you know, in Old House of Fear, many of the local islanders pop out of their hidey holes at certain points, and so there's things in the roots that he's trying to tell us. Even if there are stumps, there are still roots. That's one way to look at it.
And there's scary things in the roots. I mean, it brought to mind, I think, in her terms, that there's a lot of H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard there too, which is it's not nihilist by any means, because there's a great spiritual glow somehow, but he knows that, as you say, you perfectly put it there, James, that you want the roots, but don't kid yourself that there aren't creepy, crawly things down there in the dirt amongst the roots. And it goes to the question you asked earlier, Luke, about what does it mean to be haunted and what's haunting. And I think he's not unaware that there's dark stuff back there. That to be a traditionalist we ought not to be trapped between denying the horrors of the past or thinking we can recklessly always in a single improve them, but nor can we pretend that they aren't there, that there aren't these things digging around down there. And I don't know. I just find that interesting. I do wonder. I mean, do you think, James, is that do you draw any lesson from these stories in terms of his kind of isolation from reading that recent book? Is it Continental Right, and the ways in which he kind of is part of that, what's going to get brought up in the National Review and stuff, but that he's isolated in this place that sounds like a place from one of his stories. Could you say anything? I would really like to know more about how you see that. I have my own inchoate thoughts on the relation theoretically between these stories and the thought, but is there something in his dogged knowledge, his dark knowledge of the nature of things, that kept him from kind of getting into a more rah-rah kind of movement conservatism at the time?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. There was a great deal of tension between Kirk, let's say, and Frank Meyer, or those kind of in society of individualists. That was, they often were, these were other people coming out of the left. These were old communists, and they were all about individualism. Randianism was a big, it was in the mix very much so. And I would say that this other side kind of won out in the National Review sphere, and Kirk was kind of pushed somewhat to the side, even though he maintained a relationship. I think it wasn't as strong a relationship as it was initially with National Review. He kind of was doing his own thing. There was a time that people thought, oh, he was an isolationist. Now, what's interesting is that I think his style of conservatism is now, and this is one reason I wanted to have this conference, I think we're reevaluating it again. And it's proven to be, actually, maybe there's more to the conservative movement than supply side economics, let's say, right? Which seemed to be what it's all become. He was very open about his different perspective on all this. He was, anti-Enlightenment, or he was very suspect of the Enlightenment. I love this quote, for example: "The primary error of the Enlightenment," he wrote, "was the notion that dissolving old faiths, creeds, and loyalties would lead to a universal sweet rationalism, but deprive man of Saint Salvator, and he will seek at best Saint Science." And that's certainly, in my opinion, what's happened in this very denuded world that we're in now, where people have just come up with their own new faiths and replaced the old mysteries of life with new mysteries, although they don't admit they're mysteries.
Yeah, it makes me really wonder about where he thought, how can I say it, where he thought things were headed, or put it differently, was he really prepared to I mean, I can certainly see why the Randian side of things, and even a certain kind of optimistic, libertarianism, that, for example, and you pointed out, James, that he would probably be focused on Silicon Valley now, who are an interesting strain, who are very Randian, many of them, and are rooted in that, but at the same time, absolutely, they believe in a huge directionality to history, to progress, to where things must go, to disruption and that. And let me give you this. I don't know if you guys know this story, Skyberia. It's fantastic, and it's very strange. It's one of the handful of the ones where nothing overtly supernatural happens in it. Two guys who, as he says early on, are clearly pretty successful, probably business guys, probably Republicans, probably good conservatives and think of themselves that way, but they feel it incumbent upon themselves to get into the Michigan woods and go hunting once a year, even though both of them secretly would rather be at home on the couch watching this football on Sunday. And they get a bit lost in the woods, and there's nobody out there. And then they run into this really interesting, strangely articulate guy, Mr. Williams, and his son, who's given up his car and other things and instead just has an old horse-drawn thing, but who does no more in the story than agree to take them back to where their car got stuck in the mud so they can go home at night. And Williams, and I wonder, both Luke and James, you guys know this better, how much of Williams's voice is Kirk's voice in this. Let me give you a juicy bit. He says, there's two things I want to point to here. One is his critique of, he puts into this guy's mouth his critique of bureaucracy and modernity, but in the mouth of a guy who we would identify as kind of as if the remnant was literally going to be somebody for the apocalypse, someone who was going to be, putting cans or not canned goods, because he hates canned goods, but preparing for a post-apocalyptic future, a couple little bits of it. He's done, but they're asking about him about how he lives. We need more cash than my father and his folks did, of course. They made their clothes and never canned goods. They were clothes people, but they never borrowed. They lived in a farmer's world, mister, and we live in a city man's world. How about you? And they go back and forth, and they ask kids, and he's telling about his kids. He says, well, Rachel's the nearest. She got married, went to Chicago. The girls mostly go because they see the movies, and they can't stand to be sandhill savages like me. They think happiness is a gear in a machine. All you have to do is shift, and you'll be happy. And then there's Andrew. He's a machinist at Oldsmobile and comes home once or twice a year. They get better than $250 an hour in his department, which seems pretty nice to them, but after rent and income tax and Social Security and payments on his car and what it takes to eat in the city, you get that his dad doesn't. If they don't see this, they'll live in the smoke and the noise and the mess of last Sunday's papers and with a couple of babies and a prefab, as long as they don't see it. They tell me that with a city job, you don't have to face weather. You don't have to put up with a lonely winter. But then when it gets that, and he's got a God side to it too. He says, don't get nervous, not one of those Jesus saves folks asking about the state of your souls. Yet in the past 3 or 4 years, I've begun to understand why God is terrible. You and I and everybody else know deep down that our world is smash. And I'm thinking God wants it to smash. He wants it to smash because he's terrible. And he's terrible because he loves us. He's terrible because he wants us to be human. He loves us because we're human, but we've been trying to make ourselves inhuman. And that's why he intends to let this age, he's going to being human again. And he has a final thing where he says, the government, the unions, the chain stores, the consolidated schools, the factories, the army, the movies, radio, television, and old man arithmetic, they have got our number. But now I think because God he loves men and he's going to make them keep their human nature. He's not going to let us copy ants. He's not going to turn us over to the social workers and the planners and the generals and the organizers. He's going to burn us and he's going to starve us, but he'll keep us men. Why, I believe there was a time when if you'd offered me a steady job in town, I'd have given you the place, but not now nor ever again. Thank God he's in Siberia. There's a time in hand when people in the cities will look for rats and cats to eat and there'll be none. Or if they don't starve or burn, then the city people will be like soft machines, have to be fed and watched and replaced. They won't be men. There'll be things that take and take, but never give. Things like that don't endure long. It's a very dark kind of traditionalism he's doing there. And I know he's egging it a bit extra. And I don't know, James or Luke or any of the rest, you've got some insight into how close that is Kirk's authentic voice. It's one of the last stories he wrote, but it's a very grim sense of where we headed. There's no sense of like, yeah, there's some political program, rebalance this difference. And there's something pretty dark in again, all I could say to wrap that up is, again, he cures us of our, that's why he writes horror stories, not fantasies. There is no nostalgic fantasy there, even though we all, I think, we wouldn't be on this if we don't cherish and love elements of tradition. Pretty grim view.
Well, I mean, consider the arc of the writing here. Everything he warned us about kind of came to pass, right? From the 50s until this story, which is 80s, I would say. I don't know what the exact
it's literally
date was.
Last ones, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, morally, I agree with everything he says. I love the bit about the automobile. He hated the automobile, which is such a, for most people, such a non-conservative thing to say. You know, the 2 cars and the 2-car garage and the suburban lawn and everything. I mean, that's the conservative dream, right? And here he called the automobile the mechanical Jacobin, right? Which is so unusual. And you're even being ground up by the gears of the automobile. So he saw in a way that I still think many people have trouble seeing, just how the atomization of our culture affects us. And it's not a right or left thing. I think it's just the reality of modernity thing. He was a critic of modernity that I think, and that's why he loved the ghost story, because it was Gothic. It wasn't modern, it was Gothic. And as a critic, he, in my opinion, he transcended politics in that regard. It's not like he's writing just a right-wing parable through these stories. It's something he's operating on a totally different plane.
Yeah, I mean, because it's hard to imagine reading only these stories, and even reading now the pieces inspired by you guys and by this too. I'm inspired to read much more of his nonfiction. It's not like there's a program here. It's not like there's a platform, other than better understand the true nature of things and of humanity and what makes us human, to tolerate the corners and maybe get out of some of them. I don't know. You can see how that might have trouble in the 50s and 60s and 70s with a program that was determined to accept the existence, at least some parts of the machinery, and make it work better. Fascinating. I mean, it raises for me the whole question. I guess the thing, if there's something I keep thinking about since you guys invited me to join on this thing of like, what is that relationship? And the weird image I ended up having, and it's funny because I've been doing reading, it's kind of the same on the opposite side, to kind of look for what are the liberal equivalents of this, in the sense, or what are their horror stories, and we could, that's another conversation, hopefully a Liberty Fund conference we're going to do on sort of liberalism's monsters and ghosts also, which are, I think, found in Wells and in Stoker, it's in Dracula, it's in Jekyll and Hyde, it's in all of Wells for sure. This idea that somehow ideas, especially great ideas, have shadows like objects do somehow. And Kirk essays are the big ideas, but these stories are the shadows those ideas cast, in effect. And that in the shadows, you find the things he's not hiding, that I'm not quite sure how to say it other than to say he doesn't want to let it go easy. He doesn't want to let you take those ideas and then think you can plan your way to a better place. You have to, shadows are carried by these ideas. Those are very dark in these stories. The things that are hidden there, even the very things he's absolutely either warning us or begging us to preserve, not pretty things at all. And yet they're there.
Yeah, Kirk was fond of Chesterton's line about all life is an allegory and we understand it only in parable. I think there's something very dark in his understanding of human fallenness. There's kind of a sort of realism to it. So as many of his characters are, the good guys are still quite fallen and flawed. One of his main characters, Manfred Arcane, who we haven't brought up yet, but he shows up. He's the main character in Lord of the Hollow Dark, one of his novels, and he shows up in several of the short stories. And he's typical of this. He's a Christian. He's a Catholic, in fact, but he has a sordid past. You get kind of a little glimpse of it. He's a man of violence. He's been kind of in the Secret Service and World War II. Then he's in. When you meet him, he's an older, late middle age, and he's called a minister without portfolio, and in an African country, and he helps run the oil contracts there. You get the sense that whatever he's been redeemed from, and kind of in several of the stories that play out, one of them he's poisoned by a sort of necromancer who's going to take possession of his body. Once he gets close enough to death, he can kind of seize his body. It's a very creepy story. The peculiar domain of Archvicar Gerontian, one of my favorite probably my favorite actually of the short stories. So Manfred Arcane. So he's this flawed character. But he's also, I believe, Kirk's alter ego. I think it was a character he created, and he kind of he could do things that I think we all have that character that the sort of things we kind of wish we could do or we could do in another life. And so there he is, but he's not like I said, he's very much a fallen man. A man aware of his own sins, you might say, his own fallenness. I guess is how you'd put it in Christian terms. And he's let's talk a little bit about that. Manfred Arcane. What do you notice about this guy he shows up a couple times? What is he like beyond what I've said?
Well, I mean, the first thing, he's a great character. He almost reminds me in a less comic way of Flashman, kind of, the Flashman novels, because he shows up in surprising ways, and he's not at all painted like a good guy, and he's quite swashbuckling. I think the part of the clue in this is in the name itself, and is that his real name? There's a question throughout always of like, is that a name he's given himself? The name someone else has given him? Is that actually the name he's born with? Yes, someone's writing that he is the most in the world, Hunter. Yes, you're 100% right. and we can come back to the fact that, like, as you pointed out, Luke, like all of his heroes, I mean, with the exception maybe of, I forget his name, but the hero in Old House of Fear, who seems just good through and through. But even he's clearly had some dark experiences in the war. Well, none of the heroes, especially who actually act heroically, like Sarsfield and Bane, Sarsfield is a homeless, either former or current home, who ends up redeeming his life through time in one instant moment. Bane is also a kind of fallen, drunken ex-soldier, suddenly has the ability to redeem himself at this moment, and we see in Savior's Gate, the kind of grace that he achieves by doing that. Arcane, quite at that point, because he's also an adventurer, but again, in that name, he's the arcane, and it goes back to what James said about the anti-enlightenmentism, counter-enlightenmentism. Kane, for all that rejected knowledge, all that world of shadows that the bright light of enlightenment pushes from the world. Burke too, it's like he quotes the bit from Burke about the chivalry that's part of the cost of the loss of the chivalry that is potentially lost with enlightenment. And then here's this figure of Manfred Arcane, who is a figure from a different moral, spiritual time. And it also raised the issue, and again, it's where I wonder if you ever read Robert E. Howard, one of my favorite writers. You all know, if you know him at all, know him for having invented Conan the Barbarian, who's literally always called Conan the Barbarian, but with the idea being, as Howard liked to say, sometimes the only thing that can say, and Solomon Kane, of course. And I wondered if he's an influence on Manfred Arcane, because Solomon Kane has a lot of that, for sure. But the reason I mentioned Conan is because, as Howard has really exploded Lovecraft in one of their, sometimes the only thing that can save civilization is a barbarian. And that's kind of Arcane too. Though Solomon Kane is a Puritan, so that's another whole other matter.
Well, Dr. Kirk writes in a cautionary note on the ghostly tale that tenebrae form part of the nature of things, nor should we complain, for without darkness there cannot be light. So that's why all these stories are dark, because they help us understand the light, right, in its absence.
Yeah.
Do you, by the way, in terms of short stories, do you see any Dennis Johnson in some of what Kirk is doing, or I feel like
that Johnson might have been influenced by him?
Yeah, I kind of wonder, like the short stories, the weirdness of his stories,
Sure, there is. It's almost a Raymond Carver side to some of these, because some of them literally are just little, or Flannery O'Connor,
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And there's no doubt that Johnson and Carver are great readers of Flannery. And Flannery, it's funny, I hadn't until this moment thought of Flannery O'Connor, because they're actually peers. And I don't know if Kirk ever mentions, or vice, but they both write these, and maybe like early Joyce Carol Oates too, these slices of dark Americana and of the kind of, I don't know what to say. It's because you've mentioned the word redemption, but there's also something here about the accepting the of some of this. That's certainly in O'Connor, a good man is hard to find. Could be the title of any Kirk story as well as O'Connor's, but that's James, that's a great Dennis Johnson, and going to send me straight back to those stories and his poetry.
They're some of my favorite short stories, and just the way a Kirk story works kind of has that quality.
Yeah. Some of those short stories, it's really surprising, because you'd be reading along like in what you think, what is the pleasure we get from a ghost story or horror story? It's a cozy pleasure to some extent. I like to compare it to those of us who would never in a million years think of oh, thank you for that connection there. I'm going to look that up. When Kirk met O'Connor, I'd never be a mountain climber, but I love to sit in a warm chair and read about people dying on Everest. There's a cozy quality in some of these, and in any ghost story, you're chilled, but you're safe, etc. But then in the midst of it, he will have exactly like these stories you're talking about, James, that are like a little slice of just dark reality, of the dark, as you so well put it from him, that without which there isn't any light, and there doesn't seem to be any urge to improve that. And not only that, there's a warning about the dangers of trying too hard to play the light there or to improve it,
Right. And so with O'Connor, you had, Gothic Southern fiction. Here you might have, I don't know what you call Northern
Midwestern Gothic, yeah,
Midwestern Gothic, influenced, of course, by Kirk's ancestral Swedenborgism. And
whoa! Time out. Say something about that. I had no idea. That's fascinating. Wow,
Kirk was a convert to Catholicism, but he came from a Swedenborgist background. In fact, his ancestors settled the town of Mecosta, built the Swedenborg church there, and what holds seances, and he describes levitation and entrees, things that would come out through these kind of interactions with the spirit world, which he never discounted as just foolish superstition. He clearly saw something in it through his whole life, and it definitely came through in the haunting, the way his stories are haunted. It's something he believed in life as well, and he would tell ghost stories in person. There's a recording of him telling a ghost story of what happened at his own home to an audience. He said he didn't like to write these down because they worked better for a live audience than as a work. They weren't works of literature. They were meant to be told.
That's super fascinating. I want to just follow up on that for a second, because that Swedenborgian side of it, we think of like, the American continents is, the classic, the house was built on Indian burial ground. The idea that somehow what haunts America is just that, whatever this primordial beliefs, things, savagery, etc., that might have been there and or the resulted it. But I've always thought that part of it is also that we too easily pass over how much of the country was settled by people with some very extreme and strange. We only scratched the surface of that in Salem, and the Swedenborgianism of it is a huge part of that. I mean, and it makes so much sense as pieces are clicking together. How many of us know this, but I, like probably most of us, was brought up on the Johnny Appleseed story, right? The guy who travels across the country, that next stretch of wilderness, New England, but from kind of Pennsylvania and up and forward up into the Midwest, and that he was growing apple trees. And then you dig a little deeper, you realize, the apples trees he was giving people the seeds for weren't for eating apples; they were for making cider, and that was explicit. That's what he was just going to bring a little alcoholic joy to this. But that what he was most remembered and known for within his lifetime was that he was also a traveling Swedenborgian library, that he literally would carry this library of Swedenborg's, and I've never been able to penetrate or read those, but these mystical texts like you're talking about, James, and that literally, in addition to giving the seeds and the seedlings, he would leave these books at these different places as a lending library, and then as he came back through, pass back through. So it's really mind-blowing to me to think about that in relation to what you're saying, and this idea that what's out in the woods there are also these isolated people drinking hard cider and reading Swedenborg and looking at the relation between heaven and hell. And you get it even in the most benevolent and sort of English style of the stories. Like, it really brings to my mind Charles Williams. Similarly, a kind of someone who moves to a deep Orthodox kind of Christianity out of some very strange, in his case, almost black magical stuff, but a vision where hell and heaven are not reserved for the afterlife, nor are below and above us, but in fact are coexisting in a kind of multiverse-like way all around us. And you might find slipping through those holes at any time. And the idea that these deep, dark, impenetrable North American woods might be filled with pieces of both heaven and hell. I mean, he projects some of that, onto the old world, England and Scotland, because of what he loved. But gosh, I'd like to get out to Mecosta, because I got a feeling that must be just like haunted places in these stories.
Yeah, the central planners haven't been able to bulldoze the old heaven and hell quite fully yet and modernize it, right?
Indeed.
So we've touched on a lot in Kirk's work. One thing I want to talk just a little bit more. We talked about some of his villains, of course, the urban planner, a main target. Also, I should say, I don't know if we mentioned his name, but behind the stumps, it's Mr. Cribben. Kirk was very good at giving appropriate names to his figures. Manfred Arcane, we get a sense for who that man is, and Mr. Cribben, we get a sense for who that man is as well, just from his name. And he has what's interesting is, as we talked about, his some of his heroes are very mixed characters. In fact, some of them are ghosts or something like that. There's somebody who they have to, and through the story, they have to redeem themselves somehow. There's kind of very few characters that are kind of good all the way through. And so in some ways, his characters are much more real to life. And sometimes you don't discover that they're ghosts until the very end. I have in mind Eddie Mahaffey from Lex Talionis. You meet him, he had just gotten out of prison, and he meets one of other Kirk's kind of prototype of a villain is that horrible criminal. He has a few characters that are just violent, terrible men who I'm not going to say they're beyond redemption, but they make the deliberate choice to continue down the path, empty themselves out, and evil takes a place within them. So I have in mind here in that story, Lex Talionis, the man's name is, I believe it's Butte, I think is his name, just a thug who commits some horrendous murders and wants to go back to the house to collect some goods that he hid there. But he is terrified of something he saw after he committed the murders, and he needs a sort of fall guy. And so he latches on to Eddie Mahaffey. And as we discover, Eddie Mahaffey, it turns out, is not what he seemed. He'd been actually beaten up by Butte in prison. And all we know is that he got out. Well, it turns out he didn't get out in the way in which he sounded. Find that out to the end. And then the characters often, maybe one story we can talk about with some deep theological themes. So a lot of Kirk's work, the theological themes are not nearly as explicit. The good and evil, sometimes very mysterious and very even mixed in the characters. So the good characters have a process of redemption to bring themselves to an acceptable place. And it's usually through some sort of sacrifice, the Bane character. And he has a character, Corleolin in Lord of the Hollow Dark. So the mixing of heaven and hell in our world. And so the vicar that I talked about at the very beginning somehow he has some bridge into our world, but he's also in hell. As you find out, he's done some terrible things that damned his soul, but somehow he has some redemptive role in protecting his old dilapidated church and the very last parishioner he has there, who was a little girl many years ago. Let's some of these.
Or how about Frank Sarsfield? And there's a long trail, winding.
Let's talk about the Kirk's most successful short story.
It's that. Oh my! I think we should discuss this story without kind of ruining it. Because it's just it's tricky. But you get goosebumps and you're like, oh my God, when you get to the end of the story, you realize what's been going on the whole time. But his ability to paint these characters in such a way, I think is a result of the fact that he wasn't writing. He didn't get his MFA at an Ivy League school and then go to live in Brooklyn and try some experimental writing stuff, and just to impress his friends. He was living in a way that he was often inviting vagrants and vagabonds to live with him. Wow. In fact, one of them burned down half his house in 1975, I believe. And it was only because they had a fire door between the old house and the new house. The whole thing didn't burn down. So he was experiencing kind of characters on the edge in real life. And I think it's one reason why he had great sympathy for them in print and could paint them in such a way that we really see the nuance. These are not your typical, even writers that we praise, a lot of their characterization's terrible and so like blatant and politicized and just obvious, and not the case here at all, in my opinion.
No,
some of them are obvious. The planners are obvious. We know they're bad.
Yeah, a couple
but other ones are not.
They're not. I mean, and that's beautifully put. And I got to get back from the library Brad Berzer's biographies, and so I can dig more into these details, because I had no idea what you're describing there. But it makes so much sense when you read the stories, the tenderness with which he deals with these characters. They're tender. I say he deals with them tenderly, but without putting gauze over the lens, as it were. When you first meet Sarsfield in Long Tail of Winding, or when you first meet Bane. He's pretty clearly marked these characters as people you would probably cross the street to avoid when you meet them. They're particularly marked by the social markings would say, avoid this person. In fact, I would go as far as to say that, especially in the short stories, and we could talk, that's a different thing with the novels, because the novel requires time and investment. So the short stories are pure in this way. I don't think there's any just unmitigated. I don't think there's no belief in like pure good or evil, like you're saying, Luke, particularly in terms of the characterization of it, other than, as you point out, James, these kind of functionaries. But even then, to be motivated by some diabolical, it's in that much more Old Testament sense in which the devil convinced David to count the people. There's something else going on there in terms of two things. A, the nature of humanity, a starting from of the nature of humanity. You could call it, and I think you did, Luke, a fallen nature, or just a plural nature, that we're all some of it, and we all have shadows. And as you say, he has certain villains who are like these thugs that have been in prison. Most of the good guys have been in or through prison, or being what would have then been more thought of as hobos or vagrants. But it's not just in that sense of the human, but also this, and this is where I'm struck by, James, again, your comment about the Swedenborgianism of it. There is the metaphysics of these stories, and I don't want to lose track of A Long Tail of Winding. Everybody, it's just so full story. That one's one of the few that, though quite chilling, is not a horror story, because it doesn't leave you horrified. It leaves you elevated in this really moving way. But along with that, a story like Savior Gate, which is kind of like the Rosetta Stone to me, to the others, because it kind of explains, he literally kind of explains how his metaphysics works, in the sense that he doesn't conceive of this plane of existence, of the real, as being like this cut off, and like I say, only after death, then there's a judgment, and you're either going to go this direction or not. It's the penetration between the worlds, and clearly there's a more complicated passage after death. And again, without giving too much away, that's very clear in Savior Gate. It's kind of, he almost explains the metaphysics of it, and it's much closer to a lot of both Western and Eastern arcane esoteric ideas of, or even Gnostic ideas of the passage from this plane to the next. It's not like, bang, you're there, you're in front of the Holy Throne, and now you're going to have eternity in one place or the other. And instead, you might be walking around in this world, encounters with people who are not yet fully crossed over. I mean, there's a little bit of it in a film like, what is it, the great Shyamalan, sense, has a bit of that. This idea of ghosts, both for good and for bad, just being kind of around us, people who are a bit lost and in between. But it's hard to tell sometimes the difference between the people you might meet and the people who are crossing or passing through in these ways. It's an interesting and more complicated than either a certain kinds of traditional religious views or certain traditional horror story or ghost story views.
You mentioned Bradley Birzer. I just want to say that I believe he and John Miller did a podcast today about Russell Kirk's ghost stories. So after you folks are done here, you can tune into that. So I think we're all on to something. Let's put it that way.
Those two guys especially.
Yeah, and I should say, I think this is not in print anymore, but this is a very good collection of the short stories. There's an earlier collection that I read, which was called the Shirley Sullivan Bell, I believe, that came out around the same time as the original in the early 60s. I think this Erdsman edition came out maybe 10, 15 years ago. Has a great introduction, by the way, that you should read.
Yeah.
And here, if you happen to see it, here is the reissue of the Old House of Fear that we put out. We found a pretty good illustration to kind of carry on the legacy of the ingenue.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's really good. Yeah, we're showing off that. And if you can find them, they're hard to find. But wonderful little English press called Ash Tree Press all of whose ghost books are to be sought after and can still be found sometimes on the shelves if you find the right bookstore. And if not, from deal a little 2-volume one where they did manage to, I think for the first time, did they do it? Wait, hold that, Stephen, hold up that House of Fear edition you just held up. What is that? Oh, that's a keeper. Wow, beautiful. Though it doesn't have the beautiful redhead running across the rocks on it. Yeah, there you go.
But that's one thing we noticed when we put this book out. There's not enough in circulation right now of the fiction. So I would just suggest to everybody, if you can, buy the older copies that are out there.
Yeah, grab them up. Though beware, because one of my favorite the title gave me, but is the one that's about the book dealer who supposedly an incredible library of 30,000 books, but of course most of them are just books he enjoyed reading. They're not actually worth anything. But the discovery of what's hidden behind the bookcase that he finds there is a little warning to the those of us who are book hoarders and book collectors of what your fate may be.
I put a link in the chat here that you can listen to a reading of Ex Tenebris, which is fantastic, and you'll get the sense for Kirk's excellent writing, of course, but also the way in which the hair on the back of your neck stands up slowly as the story goes on, and that happens no more clearly than in A Long Trail of Winding, which is it won a very important award in fantasy fiction, and it deserved it because it's just absolutely excellent. And I should say, with the realism in Kirk's characters, he did model some of his characters off of people he knew or was an experience he had. So Savior Gate he saw a street, actually. He was moving quickly through a town, and he saw this beautiful lane with these great old houses, and he thought to himself, well, I got to go back there. And I think it was in a town in Scotland, and he came back through and he could never locate that street. And he asked his host, where it was, and he kind of described, where he would have been in the city and everything. And he said, yeah, there's Savior Gate. It's a street down there, but it's been dilapidated since 1914. And he kind of talks about these kind of timeless places where there's thin, because I think somebody posted, he called them kind of this world and the other world gets thin. You might interact there. But he also had a very real sense that dabbling in the spiritual world was something that might be dangerous. He has a great line where Manfred Arcane is talking to a sort of a necromancer in Lord of the Hollow Dark. And the necromancer is going to call forth these spirits and have this, kind of occultic ceremony of kind of a horrific crucifixion of a woman and her child. It's kind of this kind of horror story. It's leaving you horrified as you realize what is at foot. And Manfred Arcane just warns the guy, when you open that gate, you don't know what comes through. As it turns out, the guy, he was right. A spirit slipped through, and things don't go well for the would-be necromancer. Now, we talked about Kirk's characters. He has some great villains, different types, and he digs in many ways to kind of the nature of evil. And his characters, as we said, are for lack of a better word, they're real. Some of them are real, actually based on real people. So Frank Sarsfield was based on a hobo who Kirk knew and who lived with his family for a while. I think his name is Clinton Wallace. So a good man, and but a man with a troubled past. And he gives this great kind of, I would say that Frank Sarsfield is this great kind of tribute to that guy who'd been through the ringer. He spent some time in prison and had a lot happen to him. And then in A Long Trail of Winding, it just this great story of how that man redeems his kind of lost life. It's just absolutely fantastic.
And it's incredibly frightening, even though it doesn't necessarily have the ending you expect, but it's a terrifying story.
Yeah, no, it is. And the other thing that's worth mentioning about that story and Savior Gate and the great anecdote you shared there, Luke, about Savior Gate, and as what I was saying about the metaphysics of it, in effect, it's also just the physics of it, in the sense that, in a way that only a handful of other, ghost writers, and it's won by that story, I think, World Fantasy Award, which is an award in our field. And one, if you look through the list of that, it's not like the Academy Awards where you go back and look at some of those and go, really, that? The World Fantasy Awards is pretty infallible in finding the great works, whether they're literary or genre, that really last. But this is one of the unique ones, and I think it's part of what they were attending to there, is the movement through time and how time works in it, as how time works in, say, in that story, and the idea that that might be the dimension that when you're talking about haunting, you're automatically talking about time, as perhaps when we talk about traditionalism, we're talking about time, but time is more complicated than we know or think, and may actually be altered by our nature or by our actions. That's certainly the implication.
Now, we've been going for a little over an hour now. James and Adam, is there anything you'd like to kind of, as we wrap up this discussion, anything you'd like to leave our listeners with? And our listeners, please do weigh in with any questions you'd like to ask, anything more you'd like to know about Kirk and his wonderful fiction.
I would just share from the great man that touches on all the things we're talking about. It's in, again, one of the stories, Lost Lake, down here, when he's describing what we normally think of as haunted places. He uses a very language for talking about them that resonates to me with a lot of what we've been talking about. He says, a fatality clings to some places, not mere historic houses or battlefields, but to obscure corners recorded only in the short and simple annals. I think that's really beautiful, and it really says something about him and about his sense of haunting, about the use of the term fatality there. Reminds us of a whole different worldview that in which fate has to be taken account of too and can't be altered or improved, but also his attention to the obscure places and people of the poor, the grand houses, fields, and clearly a great and sense of identification with them.
Yeah, I would just say that I think Dr. Kirk understood the dead differently than most of us do, and I think as modern people, we're very bad when it comes to the dead, and we like to forget about them. He's in Kirk's stories always the good people are sweeping the grave sites and polishing the gravestones and that kind of thing because they remember them, and there's a quote at the end of Encounter at Mortstone Pond. It's from Eliot's Little Gidding, and this appears on one of the tombstones. And it's and what the dead had no speech for when living, they can tell you being dead. The communication of the dead is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living. And I think that's very much what informs all of his fiction and frankly all of his political writing.
That's great. That's really good. Yeah, I mean, I'll give you the Jewish spin on that. I was stunned to see a friend pointed out to me recently that in the most recent revision of the DSM, whatever, right, for mental illness, that more than 3 months of deep mourning for somebody has now got a name, and which particular antidepressant ought to be given to it. And as a Jew brought up in the year-long Kaddish tradition, and the idea that the year of mourning for a parent especially is just the awareness of their loss, I thought, wow, you just told like every ever practiced a year of Kaddish that for 3/4 of that year they were suffering from some prescribable malady, which I think illustrates what James. I just think what you said is brilliant and is the real essence of it. I really love that. And if we could really understand traditionalism or conservatism or those even ideas as being what you just said about understanding the voices of the dead, boy, that would take us a long way.
And I see in the comments that James Person mentions that the quote appears actually on Kirk's own gravestone.
Wow.
So he put it in a story on a gravestone and it appears on his own. That's quite moving.
Yeah. Sorry, Luke, I don't think you can follow that up. That's wow.
I just put another link in there to some, it's a list of essays, links of essays and resources on Kirk's ghost stories. And I should say there's the collections that have been mentioned. James mentioned a new edition of Old House of Fear. He has an excellent introduction to it that really helps the introduction to Kirk's thought on his mind. Hopefully you got a good sense of that from this discussion. And Ancestral Shadows, that collection of short stories, which is excellent. It includes Kirk's excellent essay on his own ghost stories and how he kind of sees the ghostly tale, and has a great introduction as well by Vigen Gurian. Also very helpful in understanding the moral imagination and what Kirk's really doing with his ghost stories. Adam and James, it's been excellent having you here. Adam, where can people go to find out more about you and your work? I think they might enjoy some of your projects.
Well, in the old days, we would have said, just head down to your corner Blockbuster, but I guess that's not going to work now. If you look me up on Wikipedia, my kids just pointed that out to me. There's a very bizarre essay there about me that I don't have the heart to take down or correct, even though it seems pure fantasy, just because it's so strange and weird. I wish I knew who wrote it. On the fiction side, there's certainly some very Kirk influenced work, The Haunting in Connecticut. Strangely, even my film with Snoop Dogg, the rapper Bones, was very much my response to a Kirkian childhood in the inner city Chicago and the idea of the haunting consequences of urban renewal. My show Salem you can stream on, I believe, Hulu or Amazon, or both, and certainly has a dark, but beware, it's definitely rated R+ for that. And most recently, also what was meant to be an adaptation on the beginning of an anthology series based on Clive Barker's stories called Books of Blood, also available on Hulu, actually has a lot of my attempt to do, some of it's quite failed, but some of it's okay, a very Kirkian sense of the presence of the dead and what role the dead might play, better and for worse. So, haunt, and I guess on the idea of how politics and society might interact with horror, you can find on Criterion or more easily and free on YouTube a documentary I did for the BBC called The American Nightmare, about America between 68 and 78 and the social chaos in relation to the horror films from Night of the Living Dead to Halloween. That's probably my favorite thing I ever did, and something that tries to grapple a bit with this issue of how horror as a genre might deal with and or be involved with the society and social questions.
Great. And we did have a question here. Any recommendations on other movies? We've got a few there from Adam, but other movies, recent movies, books that could be Kirkian. Some of Adam's own work fits in that category, but anything else either of you have?
It depends. I mean, I just gotta say, it depends on, we are living through a great renaissance in the horror film. But let me just say the current horror films are not for the faint of heart. Some of them are really scary. The film Hereditary is very Kirkian in the darkest possible ways, but it's one of those films I hesitate to recommend to people because it could be quite traumatic just to watch it. But it's probably the greatest horror film in this last period, I think. Though I also really think Get Out, in its own way, also from a different political perspective, though equally tries to deal with some similar, but not in as ghostly way. And in a more traditional way, in all of the attention that Sixth Sense got back at the turn of the century, a little film called Stir of Echoes with Kevin Bacon kind of got lost in the shuffle, but is one of my favorite ghost films. But I also never cease to urge people to go back to see the great adaptation of Henry James's Turn of the Screw called The Innocents with Deborah Kerr. It's my favorite Halloween viewing, and is the greatest ghost movie, I believe, ever made.
Yeah, and I would just add that I'm more horrified every day just by living
my life
in New York and taking the subway. So,
but by the way, just as a book thing, for any of you who don't know Charles Williams, who's also a very forgotten writer, but who Kirk mentions a couple times, and who was the unknown member of the Inklings, along with his better known friends C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, his supernatural thrillers of the 1930s, while not as easy to read as Kirk or as his friends, they come as close as anything else I've read to the spiritual depth, I would say, and horrors that Kirk achieves, especially his two masterpieces, All Hallows Eve and Descent into Hell.
And James, where can people go to find out more about you and your work?
Well, I speak to you from the offices of the New Criterion here on Broadway and 20th Street. Come on by, take a look at the magazine and our website, newcriterion.com. There you can find my essay, The Ghosts of Russell Kirk. This was the essay that kind of became formed the introduction to the book, and was what I delivered at the conference. And I would say that Kirk's thinking and writing since that conference has really informed so much of what I'm doing. I wrote about vernacular architecture, American vernacular architecture, the house architecture. And I do feel that we are haunted all the time by these forms that we like to ignore, but are much safer in the end respecting and understanding. And I do think that that's what Russell Kirk understood as well.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you to our sponsor, the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. Please visit kirkcenter.org to learn more about the Kirk Center. You can support the Kirk Center and the work of the University Bookman through the Kirk Center website at kirkcenter.org/donate. Next time on the Book Gallery, we will be joined by Samuel Gregg, author of The Next American Economy, Nation, State, and Markets in an Uncertain World. So keep an eye on your inbox. We'll have an invite to that webinar in the next few weeks. Thanks, everyone.